I'm going to start us off right now. Everyone here probably knows me, but I'm Chris Vitality, just in case there's someone that doesn't. We are a precision ag company here. And so I'm really excited to present Thibaut Scholasch. I first heard of him just through some of his research. So actually one of the things I've really admired about Thibaut is his academic writing is very accessible. So he actually had a couple papers on irrigation and irrigation sensing technology that I stumbled on, and it was incredibly practical and accessible. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. Like I can actually go use this in the field, and it kind of kicked off some of our work. And then through some conversations and actually then attending a webinar that Thibaut put on a few years ago now, was like, oh, this totally makes sense. This fits both what we're seeing in the research. This fits what we're experiencing in the field. And that's kind of where we got in touch and then kind of started building a relationship from there. So I'll just kind of end there, and I'll just say Thibaut's probably, for me, he's the most influential researcher on irrigation. He does a lot more than irrigation. A lot of his early work actually on color, quality parameters in grapes is also really cool. I think he has a very wide knowledge base, but for me, he's really informs a lot of how we think about irrigation, and we've really enjoyed working with him and his team at Fruition Sciences. So he's a co-founder of Fruition Sciences, and they have clients all over the world. I've asked him to mention some of his clients for context, but they work everywhere. They work in Israel, they work in South America, California, obviously France, all over. So anything Thibaut I did not say on, and again, I am underselling his resume, I will say as well. He has a very, very impressive resume, but anything I did not mention, I should have, Thibaut, because otherwise I'm handing it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Christopher, for this very nice introduction. Yes, my name is Thibaut, and just one thing I'd like to say that I am trained as a winemaker. So all of those development stemmed from initially my desire to improve wine quality and understanding what could be done beyond what's done in the cellar. So that's just for the history. And I have a little presentation, around 20 slides, because I wanted to have ample time to have a more informal conversation. So I'm sharing my screen. Let me know if that's going well. Oh. Thank you. And let's dive into what I have prepared. So Chris asked me to drop a few names. So I did. It is true that we work historically in arid regions, from Australia to Douro Valley in Portugal. But what we've understood is that the knowledge of vine water use variations is also applicable to areas where there is less aridity, or even when there is no need to irrigate, because it captures many more things about the fertility of your vineyard and also how you are priming your vineyards to either make top stellar wine quality or more generic standard wines. All of that is somehow captured in the physiological performances of the plant. So maybe what brought us to the news recently is the coverage made by Château Lafleur in Pomerol. It's a vineyard that is fairly known because it touches literally Petrus, and they have preferred stepping outside the rigid regulatory framework of appellation d'origine to adapt their technical interventions in face of the climate change. And the data that led them to take this major turn is the one that I'm going to discuss, because we've been collaborating with them for many years. So to really hammer this, I have transcribed their testimonials. So you see that we are actually diving in areas where irrigation is not yet the main practice. We are also working in Israel, and the reason why I'm bringing it is because by the end of my presentation, I will show you some climatic indices that justifies why there is a lot to be learned in terms of the climate demand and the water supply that you guys have been experiencing over the past years that makes your growing conditions very similar to Israel. So the fact that we can claim that we've been successfully developing and implementing our approach here might be meaningful for you. And also another one where we do not work necessarily with irrigation with the Roderer group in Provence. Okay, so after having dropped those names, let's take one step back and be a bit more theoretical, and I was going to say philosophical about what it is we are trying to do. Technically, we are collecting data like many other people. Everyone collects data nowadays, but we try to be sober in our data collection and to have a purpose. So collecting data in order to make legit an action that's going to be taken in the field right afterwards. And philosophically, since we say the wine is made in the vineyard, we are trying to put that saying into practice by really going into the vineyards and see what can be the direct causation between a fruit that is ripe the proper way and the wine bottle. So our method is essentially unfolded into 4 steps. The first step is measuring with a purpose, like I was saying. The second step is really important. It's analysis. Analysis is really important because it tells why, for say, a same level of water in the soil, we understand why the plant does not have the same level of comfort. So without analysis, without our capacity to put in a context a plant data, it's very hard to understand why similar conditions do not lead to the same outcomes. The measurement part, of course, I said it's very critical because that's how we objectively remember why 23 is different and how it's different from 26. But once we have coupled this first step, measurement, with analysis, then comes the decision part. And the decision is essentially what practice, considering what we've seen, makes sense to be implemented now, meaning taking into consideration the plant development stage we are at. So we need also to understand that there is a memory effect, and everything the plant has been experienced up to the day of the decision is also going to condition whatever decision we are going to recommend. And the last part, the person touching his chin, here is there to symbolize that a very important phenomenon is related to our capacity to capitalize on our experience, draw conclusions, and really assess whether the impact of our practices is where we expected it to be. So this is how really we try to help the process of decision-making in the vineyard with an objective approach. And something that's very original in our approach is that we mainly use plant data. And that is for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the plant is an extremely complex system, and trying to measure all the production factors that affects the plant and that are captured in a very complex web of interaction with one another is really complex. But even if we were able to create a model that predicts based on the weather, based on the soil, based on the rootstock, based on the varietal, how the plant will behave, still we will be probably deceived because the plant is capable of self-training. So by the time we figured out how the plant responds, it has probably evolved onto a different type of behavior. So our approach is that we prefer to follow the plant without trying to guess how it fusions so many different factors and base our response considering how the plant has behaved. So really putting the plant at the center of any decision is our trademark, I would say. And so how do we put that into practice? So here I'm going to spend a little time, but I think it's really the core of our approach. And bear in mind that what I'm going to say is for red varietals, mainly driven for a high quality target, but a similar slicing of the season would occur if we were to grow a white varietal. We will simply put an intensity and a severity of our practices at a different moment. So this framework is valid for different wine profile. It's just that we change our operation within that framework. And so how do we see the season? We slice the season into 5 periods because during a season, the vine goes through different physiological stages, and therefore the ecophysiological parameters at stake are going to be different. Typically, once bud break has occurred, the plant is very sensitive to water and nitrogen deficiency, less so during the next period, the period we called herbaceous growth. During that period, actually, the period 3 that starts at berry set and that lasts until veraison, the photosynthetic activity is not too impacted by moderate water deficit. The peak of nutrient assimilation is past, so we can play with water deficit. And so this is our window to prime the fruit. We have 3 objectives during that period 3. Train the plants to be stronger, so less susceptible to drought, less susceptible to heat waves. Second objectives, determine berry composition by activating secondary metabolism. By the end of that period, the total amount of tannins, the total amount of polyphenol is set. There is nothing you can do later on. It's just a matter of realizing or not realizing the potential that you have accrued during that period 3. And the last important point during that period 3 is that we determine the maximum berry size that will be potentially reached at the end of period 4. So a lot is going on. P3, that period 3, that period of herbaceous growth, is your window of opportunity to optimize water deficit and its effect on fruit, therefore its effect on wine quality. Period 4 is the period of maturation. During that period, most of the water comes from the leaves, not so much from the roots. So we are at that stage in a logic of protection against water deficit. Even if water deficit tolerance is a bit sturdier at that time, we can afford to trigger irrigation at lower threshold. We are really trying to avoid the drawback that drought and heat wave combined can have on fruit integrity. And the period 5 here, we know that during that phase, whatever we do at the root system has no impact on the berries, because the berry at that stage has become gradually disconnected from the plant and only responds to the environment, namely the vapor pressure deficit, which is essentially how dry and hot is the atmosphere around the berry, so the microclimate. So it does not pay to irrigate during that phase if you are trying to fight turgidity. You are solely going to affect the canopy. So in conclusions, what I want to take home from this slide is that different rules exist for best practices, and that is because plant physiology is different during each period. And so you will see how we have built a decision system based on plant indexes that are proxies to describe how each period is affecting the outcome of the next. So typically during the period of shoot and flower development, we are going to monitor the rate of leaf area development to identify either nitrogen or water deficit early. Why do we do that? We don't measure the canes for the canes, but because for their roles as proxies to alert us if we have early suspicion of water or nitrogen deficits. Then during the herbaceous growth, we are really focusing on sap flow. That is to say how much water the plant is conveying from the ground up and into the atmosphere. And so at that stage, we have ruled out the risks of nutritional deficits, and water deficit during that period here in yellow is the main production factor to manage. So that's, remember, the perfect moment of the season to play with water deficit, because it pays off at the end in terms of more uniform harvest and maybe more concentrated fruit and maybe more polished tannins. All of the complexation between anthocyanins and tannin will be a reflection of what's going to happen during that yellow stage. So in conclusion, that P3 is your window of opportunity to optimize water deficit and its impact on the final fruit composition. So again, we don't measure the water flow, the sap flow for the sake of it, but for its role as a proxy to prime the wine profile. Then during the maturation phase, we are going to look at a fruit that is connected via the phloem to the plant. So during that phase, we look at the sugar loading, that is to say the sugar mass, not the sugar concentration, but the gain in sugar mass per berry. And we want to detect the precise moment of hydraulic disconnection to then anticipate the impact of decision as harvest approaches in terms of risk versus rewards, knowing that there is nothing that the plant can do to help the fruit keeping from dehydration if we have a heat waves. So having acquired this ability to discriminate between plants still hydraulically connected, we are in period 4, plants no longer hydraulically connected, we are in P5, helps you assessing the risk of yield loss versus the reward if you decide to extend your hang time. So again, we don't measure sugar for sugar, but for its role as a proxy to separate those periods, confirm that we have reached the potential of polyphenol maturation. And additionally, it gives us early insight into the pool of acids, which will also impact the coloration. So now we'll just spend a few minutes showing to you the principles. So when we are measuring the leaf area growth dynamics, we are actually getting rid of 3 things are actually driving leaf area dynamics, the heat, the water, and the nitrogen. So we are removing uncertainties coming from leaf development speed due to a lack of heat by expressing the speed per growing degree days. And days in, days out, years in, years out, we see that there are 2 phases in that speed of fruit elongation. A first phase right after bud break where that speed is high, and a second phase during which that speed is low. And so expressing in relation to degree days the canopy growth rate is a way for us to really pinpoint at whether water deficit or nitrogen deficit is the culprit that we need to correct. And you see that the reward, the benefit you get from intervening when you are driving at high speed is much better because you will have a much greater impact as opposed to try to gain some additional leaf area development by mid-June or end of June when every process is happening at a very slow rate. If now we look at the next period, the yellow period, the one I was telling you is actually priming the fruit quality potential. If we are coming into that early veraison without having experienced water deficit, you will see that the berry coloration window will extend over a longer period of time. Therefore, you are going to ripen a fruit where berry-to-berry heterogeneity is more pronounced. As opposed to having induced some moderate water deficit during that period of herbaceous growth, the reward from that is that you're going to have a greater synchronization of all your berry ticking under the same clock and therefore getting red at the same time, which translates in winemaker terms a more uniform harvest. So the decision of harvesting is easier to make. The fruit composition in the tank is easier to manage simply because you have realign the time clock at which each berry is ticking thanks to these water deficits that you have carefully induced during period 3. Maybe the most important slide. Here you see the sugar mass inside the berry or the volume of the berry. Sorry, I should have said the volume of the berry. As time goes by period. And so you see that during the herbaceous growth, most of the flow of water helping the mass of the berry to increase its volume is coming from the roots. Therefore, water deficit experienced by the plant is directly impacting fruit composition. But that only gets you up to the lag phase, when the berry is still green. Then you have that second phase, the maturation phase, during which whatever water goes into the fruit is a very sugary water, it's phloem. And so it's a water flow that does not originate necessarily from the roots. It originates, to put it simply, from the leaves. So that's the first bracket, the first hydraulic transition we have. But that's not it. Then we reach 21, 22 bricks maybe. And the final hydraulic disconnection happens when even the phloem breaks from its relationship with the berries. And then fluctuations in berry volume are under the regulation of how dry is the atmosphere. So the third hydraulic transition is the one we are actually trying to pinpoint with our data collection program in order to not be surprised if from one day to the next we are going to lose 20, 30, 40% of our production, even if we had irrigated 2 days ago. It's because the plant and the fruit had been hydraulically disconnected. So key moment exists for irrigations, and we need to decide of the legitimacy of those moments according to how hydraulically the fruit is related to the plant. So how do we do that? We do that by associating the plants to a bunch of pipe articulated with one another, within which water is circulating. And we apply a tiny amount of heat, and we look at how much the water flow is transferring heat from point A on your left to point B on your right. And that's how we can convert from a heat measurement, an actual measurement expressed in liter per plant. And that's how we are measuring the actual water consumption to characterize how a soil unit or a specific season is driving the peak of water consumption and the lows of water consumption. And so that's exactly what I want to share with you. Here you see a not so lucky site in Pomerol this year. And you see that we started off the season in June with a level of vine water need satisfaction matching 100% of what the plant needs. And you see that due to the lack, to the mismatch between water demand, which is the light, the temperature, the wind, and water supply, which is the rain, the plant is not able to maintain its satisfaction at 100%. So as a result, from one day to the next, it provides less and less water. It is more and more frustrated in terms of satisfying its water needs. And what's very interesting, and here you see we are really scratching the bottom of the root reservoir. The plant is wilting, and it is actually cavitating, meaning that its hydraulic integrity, its ability to keep functioning is now jeopardized, so much that when we get those late August rain, the plant can merely go back to satisfy 40% of its initial needs that were 100. So here we've lost 60% of plant functionalities, and that started from July 15. So if you have a plant cycle that lasts from May to end of September, you have truncated 2/3 of it, and that's 2/3 is 2/3 of the plant season where you do not store carbohydrates, where you do not induce nice bud fertility for the next season. So not only are you not going to get your yield, you're not going to ripen your fruit that season, but more importantly, next year, you don't have the carbohydrate reserves to have a nice shoot elongation after bud break, and your bud fertility declines, so your vineyard fertility declines. So this is a very alarming stage, and you see that's done in an area where irrigation has not yet been authorized. But that's because I think they have not understood what's really going on inside the plant. But for people who have, you see that, so that's typically La Fleur, we have here a good reason to compensate the mismatch between water supply and water demand by carefully having 1, 2, and 3 irrigations. And you see those irrigations are not leading to a massive blow into the water need satisfaction. They just keep up with a minimum level of vine water need satisfaction in order to preserve the yield, in order to preserve water the plant functions, so that next season in 26, we don't see the yield dropping 40% simply because the plant could not even synthesize its fruitful buds. So that's why we are doing is not only preparing the plant to make the best possible wine, it's also preserving plant's functionality so that the vineyard keeps being profitable. I wanted also to bring another example from Chile, where the climatic demand reaches a similar demand to yours. And you see here we have an operations where we have sliced a block into two parts. The dark blue part where it's irrigation as usual, and this part here with the 0 where we did our irrigation program saying that we were going to irrigate only when the plant claims it needs it. And you see here the water savings were enormous because at no point in time the plant showed signs that there was a down-regulation of its water use. It was using less water. So here you can see actually how much water the plant was using. It was using 120 liters instead of 130. But you see that the 10 liters difference per plant is actually probably induced by the excess water that has been brought up by unnecessary irrigations. The same goes on here, 128 versus 145, but here we had put 75 liters. And the same goes on here, 125 instead of 150, but we had put 50 liters. So you see that, in a nutshell, all the irrigations that you had put into the vineyards got immediately vaporized into the atmosphere, so it's water for nothing. But there is a vicious side effect behind here, is that having maintained the plant in an overly abundant amount of water supply kept it in a more vegetative state, which meant that the dark blue got harvested 20 days after the pale blue, where by carefully managing water deficit, we actually hastened the onset of veraison, which helped us hastening the end of the hydraulic disconnection. And we harvested maybe 10 days into that phase where the fruit was hanging free without being hydraulically connected. And that was still 20 days earlier than the other side of the range. But within that 20 days, we lost yield. We lost here not so much, we lost only 1 ton. But that explains to you these surprising results. Dry farming, in that example, led to higher yield because we could harvest earlier and therefore get the fruit before it got dehydrated because it ripened faster. And the last example here in Sonoma in California this year, where you see sometimes there is no way, if you do not irrigate, you scratch the bottom of the root reservoir very quickly. So here, by carefully distributing 4 irrigations, we were able to keep that vineyard in the Grand Cru, and making sure that we have done so in a way that kept the vine integrities, and so we are fairly confident that it should produce again this year in a similar fashion. So that's what I wanted to share before transitioning with some data coming from Osoyoos that Michael had helped us collecting, and that will be a nice segue into getting Michael in a conversation with me. So I just wanted to share 4 things that really caught my attention when we started collaborating. This is the evaporative demand expressed in liters per square meter. You guys crept in July and August in the vicinity of 7, 8.5. That's very similar to what we get in Portugal or Israel. So you have a climatic profile that bears more similarities with arid climates than Bordeaux or all the more oceanic faces. So that's already for inspirations. But more importantly, your growing degree days profile. So here we are looking at the thermal time accumulation. It really sets the speed at which the clock is ticking for the plant. The greater that number, the faster goes the season. You are reaching by middle of October values over the last 2 years spread between 820 up to almost 2000. So already there is a huge variability years to years. But more importantly, those values at the end of the seasons are high. To give you some perspective, in Pomerol, which is hot, for Bordeaux, we are at 1500s. In Languedoc, we are at 1800s. But more importantly, you have a very slow start. You are barely reaching 200 by May, but still you end up finishing like Paso Robles or Israel. So that means that the slope at which you are accumulating temperature is very steep. So that means it's like driving a Ferrari where every turn has to be done at 200 kilometers per hour, as opposed to regions where the heat accumulation pattern is much slower, so a less steep slope. So that's, for me, drives the call for the fundamental importance of intervening in the vineyard super early, because everything happens at a very fast rate and with large amount. So then here I have tried to characterize how the dryness of the air is a risk to keep your fruit turgidity. Vapor pressure deficit is the measurement we use to characterize the pressure that is exerted on the berries to extract water away from it. And typically, values below 4 are not a concern. But you spend in 25 so many days in the ranges of the 5s. And here in gray, you see in 24, you had those peaks above 6.5. So that means that on those days, in the level of vine water use can be doubled, sometimes threefold. So in one day, you lose what you had put in your vineyard thinking it was going to last for 3 days. But also, if here you are at a point where the fruit and the plant are hydraulically disconnected, you know that this peak is going to be having a very bad impact on your alcohol level, your acid degradation, and your volume. Whereas if you are still hydraulically connected, chances are that you may smooth and buffer the detrimental effect of that peak. So you see why in introduction I was showing Israel as a reference, because in terms of climatic demand, you are comparable situations, but in terms of water supply as well. I was very surprised to see how little rain you get, since on those sites we have 2 years here in 21-22 where we were at less than 200, and the last 2 years we barely reached 300. So no questions that there is a mismatch between climatic and the demand. And in your case, irrigation is not a question. It's a matter of timing distribution. So with that, I'd like to invite Michael to have a conversation so we can actually see how possible and realistic it is to decipher the vintage according to this method.
Yeah, I mean, well, thanks for that, Thibaut. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I mean, for us, we've been working with Fruition going back 2-3 years. So obviously the vintages 23 and 24 were kind of wipeouts. We weren't able to install the sap flow sensors for those vintages because of obviously the frost. But in 2025, which was the first vintage where we pulled a respectable crop and we actually made wine from the vineyard, we saw a massive help working with Thibaut and the team. As Thibaut mentioned, in 2025, there was that heat wave, which was the first real big heat wave we got in 25 at the beginning of September. And as we've been tracking the whole vine and following and speaking with Thibaut and the team, we knew that was going to have a massive impact on all our wines. And we basically managed our harvest around that heat wave. The other thing with working with Fruition has been really to understand better the problems we have. You know, we always knew that irrigation was really, really important for us. And it's something we spent a huge amount of time working on it. And really working with the team at Fruition really opened our eyes that, wow, maybe we're doing this wrong. Maybe we need to take a step back and do things differently. You know, historically, we've been really working with sending poor interns out at either very, very early in the morning or at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to go to eat pressure bombs, and then have huge amounts of data and being like, right, is this right? and you know, working with the team at Fruition has opened our eyes to doing things differently. And it's also shown us that we grow grapes in an extreme environment. It's hot. We need to irrigate, but we also need to irrigate at the right moments. And so, you know, the September, breaking it out into different periods really, really helps us. It becomes really easy for us on site to manage the different sites really well. And also what was great is working with Thibaut and saying, look, these are the problems we have, and this is how we want to affect it. This is what we want to work with. And one of them for us was really high alcohol levels. And so historically at Osoyoos Rose, we could be bringing things in, some Merlots at 16.5 degrees of potential alcohol, having to wash them down, RO them, spend a lot of money, not great for the wine quality. And 2025, because we'd been tracking the grapes and because we'd been working Fruition, we finished ferments, we were at 14.5 in potential alcohol. Bang on, really where we wanted to. Because we'd been tracking it, because we'd been using their VT360 software, we're able to basically irrigate at the right moments and know, look, we have this heat wave, we have a week to 10 days to harvest. This is it, we can't wait. And I see that as really helped us. And I'm really looking forward to it. Finally, because touch wood, no frost this year, we're finally able to put the sap flow sensors in. I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what that does for us. And working with them as an absolute fountain of knowledge. And every time I have a meeting with them, I learn new things. I can't recommend them highly enough. that's what we've made of it here, and it's been great working with them. And their VT360 software is great. I've always been a bit hesitant. I hate traceability software because I feel like you spend your life on the computer looking at the traceability software. But the way they break it down and the way that you track everything through growing degree days means you can compare vintages very easily. And it makes, as we've got massive vintage variability here, as Thibaut touched upon, the fact that we get such cold winters means that, bud bursts can move anywhere 2 to 3 weeks. And so, if you look at 2022, our bud burst for us was sort of first week of May, whereas, last year in 2025, our bud burst was 15th to 20th of April. So there you've got that 2 to 3 week window. And so you throw the Julian calendar out the window and you just track it with their growing degree days. And then having everything on VT360 and measuring everything through growing degree days, these days I set up meetings with Chris and Thibaut and I say, well, we'll meet at sort of 350 growing degree days. But it's good. It's really opened our eyes. And I can't recommend them highly enough. It's really transformed us. And in terms of yields, obviously we've only really got one vintage where we've got the actual, a good vintage. But we're really happy with what we have in 2025, where we followed the irrigation recommendations and everything went through them. And this is even before us using the sap flow sensors. It's allowing us maybe even just go back to the basics of understanding better what the vine is doing by measuring the things, the shoot elongation, sugar loading, the apexes, just going back to basics and focusing on what really is important has been great. Yeah. Chris, do you have anything you want to mention? I'm forgetting.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. And one thing I wanted you both to talk about was a bit also, Michael, on your site, especially thinking about different varietals and then maybe even areas where you're thinking about different style. So it's kind of the approach changing, not just being general. Good.
Yeah, for us, it's Cabernet. Like obviously we make wine from one big site. So it's a 100-acre bench in Osoyoos. Very hot, as you can see. And for us, we've had some real issues in getting the cab to the ripeness levels that we want, and working with, occasionally getting shriveling cabs and not getting the ripeness that we want, and maybe getting high alcohol, but just disjointless ripeness levels. And so really having a different approach to each variety and each block has been great. We don't treat the whole vineyard as one. We break them up into different zones and treat them differently. And I think I'm hoping, and I think we'll really get to that next level this year when we finally get to install those sap flows. I think we'll really, really better understand everything that's going on. But just beyond irrigation, we've been working with Thibaut with whole replant, really helping us better. When we replanted, we decided we're replanting for the next 30 years. We want to make wine 30 years from now in a climate with 30 years from now. You know, Osoyoos rose was historically planted back in the 90s with the ideas of the 90s by people who probably learned how to make wine maybe in the 70s. And so, you know, it was planted maybe with not in the way that it should have been, you know, for the climate of today. And so we had a couple of meetings with Thibaut, and, you know, with that, we decided to change how we prune, just change how the trellis is made up, change the root stocks and the rest of it. And it's been great having Thibaut and the team from Fruition from A to Z there. Yeah, it's been great. I don't know. Yeah.
And then what I was just gonna ask, and then like, what does the day-to-day look like? I think that's interesting too, especially like I really want to, and I was gonna ask Thibaut this as well, talk a bit about pre-sap, just pre-sap flow, because obviously, you know, sap flow, for context, for those who know Fruition, sap flow is kind of really for premium sites for where you want to grow high-end wine. And then for other areas, it's more of a manual approach, which Osoyoos was taken because of the damage. So yeah, talk a bit about that.
So the manual approach, it requires a bit of labor, but honestly, you just get faster and faster and faster. Thibaut, maybe I'm doing it wrong, but this is what we do. We go through once a week and we do sheet elongation at the beginning of the season. You flag the vines, so you have your reference point in the block you want to do. You flag the vines, you flag the shoots, you measure the shoots, and you do it once a week. I mean, we figured out that for each spot we're doing, maybe with sheet elongation, you're looking at 20 minutes, half an hour, but it gets quicker, it gets faster, and the information you get out of it is huge. And then when it comes to the sugar loading, well, then there's also the apexes, but you can just download an app, and the apexes are done very quickly. And then with the sugar loading, well, it's like taking samples during we all take samples to see where we are for maturity sampling. You just start it earlier. It does require you to be, you know, not slammed. We take interns to do this for us, and I've noticed that's the best way to do it, is that you can go to the mountain vineyard and go do it. What we have done is that, you know, the first years we just did 5 sites, and now we're expanding to doing the sheet elongation and the manual controls on basically all our sites, because we just find the information is so key. And then you just upload it up into VT360, or you just send it to the team at Fruition and they'll do it for you. They already speak to their VT360, already speaks to our weather stations on site. And so that automatically uploads all the growing degree days. And then at the moment, the big one for us is before we went to Lumo, I'm going to rep Lumo here, we had to manually upload all our irrigation. So we just put them into CSV files and upload it, and it does it automatically. Now that we've gotten better irrigation management and tracking, they should just all magically do it together. And the team from Fruition just send out emails once a week being like, we don't think you need to irrigate in these blocks. We think you need to irrigate in these blocks. Looking at the weather forecast and the rest of it as a simplified approach. Yeah, and, you know, whether we have a question or we've got some, you know, we're not sure about something, you know, we jump on a call with them, send them an email, and we have meetings with them at the beginning and end of each period. So every sort of 6 weeks, 2 months, we're meeting up with them. Yeah. Thibaut, unless I hope I haven't, you know, said the wrong things, but that's roughly.
No, thank you. It's perfect.
Yeah. I haven't been paid by Fruition. I'm putting this out there.
Yeah. I have not.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add, Thibaut, and then I'll transition us to Q&A?
No, I'm good.
Maybe one final question, Michael, and then everyone. So I'm going to move us to Q&A, please, in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. I've prepared. Whenever I talk with Thibaut, I always have about 32 questions to ask. Even watching this now, I always get new ones. So I'm going to ask Michael a question, and then we'll transition to Q&A. So you can, again, please throw into the chat, and I'll ask them for you, or you can unmute yourself as well and just kind of jump in. And so we'll kind of do that for another 15 minutes. But my final question, Michael, was how stressful was it coming from kind of approach you've been taking for a number of years at Osoyoos to, okay, now it's July and August, and it's like, no, don't don't irrigate. And my second part of that question is, how long were some of those gaps in the kind of the heat of the summer? Like, how far have you been pushing?
Yeah, so
irrigation?
The first couple of years, 2023 was the first year we really did it, and we decided to do a couple of blocks our way and a couple of blocks the Fruition way. And yeah, some of the gaps went on longer, but we were hoping, well, longer than we were expecting. But in the end, we're happy with what we saw. The vine could hold it. What for us really was irrigating more earlier in the season and stopping early. That's the key for us is realizing how dry and how really paying attention on the winter we've had and the weather we've had, and thinking, actually, wow, we really need to put a lot of water down very early in the season and then stop earlier and then continue maybe later on. And it's maybe slightly nerve-wracking at the beginning, but trust them. We very quickly went the whole vineyard. We just listened to Fruition very quickly. So yeah, they trust them. That's what I'm saying. You'll be fine.
Do you remember how long some of the gaps were between, like how long you were going? I should have pulled this up beforehand, but in July, August.
I don't have it off the top of my head. I mean, weeks.
Yeah. In the middle of summer.
In the middle of summer, yeah. Yeah. Several weeks in the middle of summer.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, Michael. Really appreciate you sharing, taking the time. So I'm going to move us to Q&A, and I'll just make a quick comment. So obviously Fruition, just on the business of Fruition, is a kind of consultancy, and that's kind of their business model. They work around the world. Obviously, if you're ever interested in working with them, we ourselves rely on them heavily and work with them with a number of clients. So we're pretty excited. And there's kind of different approaches that they take. So depending on the size, all kinds of different scales and things like that. So I'm going to move us to Q&A. Actually, one other thing I'll say too, kind of today, what we wanted to focus on was kind of very high level irrigation concepts. Obviously, we could have gone into a lot more detail in any of this. Obviously, we could have dove really deep. And also, there's a lot more with Fruition, a lot more I've learned working with Thibaut around. They've got some really cool data. You can find it online. I'm happy to share it. Presentation they did around some of their work in Pomerol, around cover crops. So they've cover crops that actually have a really big impact. There's lots in cover cropping, plant management. We might get into this a bit with questions, but like, how do you actually handle a heat wave? What should you be doing with the canopy based on different stages? There's just really a lot we could go into. We wanted to obviously focus a bit more on general irrigation and wine quality today, which could be its own multi-part series, but there's a lot of different topics we can't go over. And please, if you have questions about it, please, while we have Thibaut, feel free to jump in. And I'll kick off with our first question. Thibaut, just around now, what about whites? And especially like if you're thinking about different styles of white wine, how are you approaching that versus, say, Michael with one of his Merlots? How does that change the kind of generally the strategy you're taking?
Yeah, so you've understood for the red, we try to induce some moderate but strong water deficit, lasting. When I say strong, I said lasting weeks. With a white, we will probably not do that at all. We will seek to actually extend the duration of period 2. And once we are getting into the phase where the stomates don't regulate how open they are, we are trying to actually not tolerate so much of a stomata closure. So we will probably alleviate water deficit more regularly. Still, the philosophy would be to train the plants to resist drought. So for that, we would space out irrigations in between 2 events to teach the plants how to cope with drought intervals. But we will probably not tolerate a level of water deficit that is as limiting as it would be, say, for red that you want to age 10 years.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to open.
There is another part on nitrogen, but I don't have time to. We will have a different handling of the nitrogen for aromas also, of course.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll open the floor to questions, and if there's a bit of a break, I've got about 30 more. So please jump in if you have any questions.
Okay.
Oh, so Shay's got a question here. Could you speak to connection between irrigation strategy and canopy management? We typically hedge and are removing laterals, plus we're doing leaf removal. Should we be doing this with this type of irrigation strategy, and what are the expected impacts on quality?
Yeah, that's okay. So something I didn't elaborate is the concept of basal crop coefficient. So in fact, what we are doing at the end of the canopy growth, we are looking at what is the maximum amount of water the vine can carry. We speak of hydraulic conductivity. So what you are doing when you're removing leaves, hedging at different height, at different time, moving the laterals, you are affecting the total amount of water that the plant needs to put into motion to stay happy and healthy. So definitely your interventions on the canopy will drive the timing when the water is needed for the plant. So the method will not change, but definitely by manipulating the canopy, you are manipulating the demand. And so since with irrigation, you are manipulating the supply, changing the demand will inexorably change the pace at which you're going to satisfy with a different offer. So I can see that you will probably space out even more your irrigations if you had reduced the total amount of light that is being intercepted by your canopy. And then the question is, how do you manage the microporosity? How do you manage the microclimate? Should you trim your vineyards to provide a nice protective environment during period 4, even if that means pushing a little bit more the laterals? But then the extra water use due to the presence of lateral, can it be compensated by a reduction of canopy size? Probably yes. To which percentage? That's where we are starting to monitor that. So you are asking the right question, and I think the path will be to really be sober with irrigation, because the more we water, the more we dilute, the more we are actually fighting against our winemaking goals. So we need to put water, but only when it's necessary. And a way to reduce the water addiction is to reduce the leaf area size.
Okay.
You have any follow-up there, Shay, or that answered the question?
Oh, I've got all kinds of things on my mind, but I think I have a feeling that's for you and I to just figure out our strategy, right, for our site, Chris. So yeah.
Cool. Maybe just as a follow-up for that, Thibaut, could you talk a little bit about how you've been changing some of your thinking around canopy volume? Because obviously, just to really clarify, what you're talking about with canopy area is you're talking about pushing the canopy wider, increasing lateral so that the width of the canopy is increased, trying to increase that as much as possible to increase leaf interception, but then shortening so that maybe the total leaf surface area that you have is shrinking. Talk please about that, please.
Yeah. Well, to put it simply, you have to pick your poison. And I think we are more at risk of losing quality in terms of wine if during that period 5, the fruit is overexposed. So I'd rather tolerate a little bit more shade around the cluster, because I know that when the time comes of deciding whether or not we want to postpone harvest, a good protective microclimate provided by the lateral might be more adequate than watering, because at that time the watering will serve the canopy but will not go into the fruit. So that's the first consideration. Do you change the shape of your canopy tackling water use and photosynthetic activities, or tackling the microclimate environment of the clusters? That's for the laterals. And then for the height, basically the greater height and the greater spread is going to open the faucet through which the water is going to vaporize into the atmosphere. So by upping or downing the size of the light you intercept by means of the blade of your hedging height, or by means of tolerating more or less width or more or less porosity by removing leaf layers, is going to drive how quickly you're going to dry out your root reservoir. So if you actually maintain a nice microclimate around your cluster, a sufficient amount of leaves to reconstitute sufficient reserves, then maybe once you have done that, you can afford to have fewer leaves so that you keep more water for later, and you make your vineyard not so dependent on your next irrigation. You foster drought resiliency.
Excellent. Thanks. Other questions? So Lindsay has a question about watering vineyards for sparkling wine production. We've been starting to pick around the third week of August when it's still very hot. So what can we do with sparkling wine in that context?
So with sparkling wine, typically you harvest the fruit while you're still in the sugar loading. So the fruit is still technically hydraulically connected. So essentially the watering you may have, if it's excessive, might dilute further the aromas, but that may actually be aligned with your production objectives if you want to lower the bricks. So it's not an easy answer. I should understand better what your production objectives are, what your logistic constraints are. But in a big picture, it doesn't seem defeating the purpose of having large berries, keeping them fresh and with a high pool of acidity. The issue I see is that if you irrigate too much during P3, you may delay the start of sugar loading. And if you delay the start of sugar loading, you may have more heterogeneity berry to berry, and the call of picking around the third week of August might be a little bit more difficult to make because we'll have to manage more berry to berry heterogeneities. So that's why your question is not simple to answer. And don't forget that if you are in P4, your irrigation still affects the plant, but through the phloemion pathways, not through the xylem. So you might be also better off misting. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, Lindsay, if you have a follow-up to that, throw that in the chat, and we'll follow up. I had one other quick question I think that'd be helpful for people. We obviously talked about sap flow. So you kind of, in terms of manual tools, you talked about shoot elongation, and then for those premium sites, obviously having sap flow sensors. But where that's not possible or it's not a premium site, whatever, can you talk a bit about just quickly about using Apex monitoring and why you measure shoots until you hedge or you hit your max canopy, and then what other tools we can use if we don't have sap flow sensors to make irrigation decisions and quality?
Essentially, you are trying to detect the point in time, considering the season, where there is a switch whereby the plant stops investing its energy towards more green stuff, essentially vegetative organs, might be the roots, might be the trunk, might be the leaves, as opposed to vesting its energy flow towards reproductive organs, the fruit. And we know that as long as the conditions are met for the vines to push the apexes to be active, that switch has not been acted upon. So as long as we see this activity going on, we know the plant is managing its pool of carbohydrates probably as a priority over managing the ripening of its offsprings, which are the fruits. And so there is less of an incentive to get that offspring very appealing for a bird, rich in sugar, rich in color, so that we can go and conquer different niches. So tracing the point in time where there is that shift, meaning the apex's activity starts to decline, tells us that the plant is shifting its physiological metabolism towards the secondary metabolites, which not only serves the birds for dissemination, but also the winemaker's goal. So that's why we use it as a proxy, for lack of a better one, in order to organize the schedule of the next irrigations.
Excellent. Yeah. And so you'll go around and actually it's actually looking at apexes. There's lots of research and even public tools on this, on using that as a tool for that decision. We're just hitting 10 here. Is there any final questions? Maybe one final question. I'll give about 30 seconds here. Please pop up. If not, I'll close this down. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone. Here we go. Okay, Lindsay, thank you. Final question from Lindsay, and then I'll wrap us up. So her question, Thibaut, is just how does vine age come into play when you're thinking about the strategy?
The vine age, you remember the the graph I showed you, where there was a free fall in vine water need satisfaction, that was meaning that on day 1, the vine was using 5 liters when the weather was asking 5. On day 2, the vine was using 4 liters when the weather was asking 5. On the day 3, the plant was using 3 liters when the weather was asking 5, to make it simple. What we see is that vine age buffer the speed at which we have that collapse. So the vine will go from maybe not starting off at 5, but maybe starting at 3.5. And on day 2, it will be at 3.4, 3.3. So the vine age essentially ease and smoothen the collapse of vine water need satisfaction. So that will drive a different frequency of irrigation for sure.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, again, something else we could go a lot more into. So I'm going to end us here. Kind of a heads up, we're going to, there's a recording, I've recorded this, so we'll send out a recording to everyone. We had lots of people asking for that. We're going to do a follow-up webinar. I've talked with Thibaut, so probably in a month or two, couple months, on some related, but expanding on some of these topics, introducing some new ones. And as well, Thibaut's going to be here at some point in July. We're just scheduling that to meet with some clients. I'd highly recommend checking out just even his published research. A lot of what Fruition's done, they've got lots of resources online. It's been a huge, huge help for us. And even just fitting it, and it's been very interesting. Obviously, like a lot of us are familiar with Marcus Keller. There's lots of overlap there. You know, between kind of how they think about irrigation and timing and strategy, and some important differences as well. So just in closing, I'd really like to appreciate you, Thibaut, taking the time to kind of look over data, look at what we're doing, and share that with us. So thank you so much.
But thank you for these wonderful opportunities, and it's nice to interact with Canadians.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Hope
Well,
you have
a
a
good
great
day.
day.
Bye-bye.